This video is brought to you by Straight Goods News, Canada's alternative online news source. Visit straightgoods.ca.
You know, it's pretty bad when Canadians like me start longing for the good old days of Brian Mulroney. He was hounded from office in the 90s, as you know. They called him Lion Brian at the end. And gosh, he could be nasty. He was a slick operator. There was trade deals he crammed down our throats. But in comparison with today, things were fairly progressive. For instance, he hired Elizabeth May and a number of other environmentalists, and together they launched a system that became known as environmental assessment, which Stephen Harper trashed last week in his budget. He hired women in unprecedented numbers. 11 of them he put in his federal cabinet, and hundreds of them on courts and agencies and boards and commissions. He opposed U.S. policy in Nicaragua and welcomed refugees from Honduras and Guatemala, and he launched the International Center for Human Rights and Democratic Development, which became known as Rights and Democracy. And he made Ed Broadbent, the former NDP leader, its first president. Rights and Democracy went on to have an outstanding career of promoting rights, democracy, the advancement of women, protection of Indigenous people around the world. And it gained Canada an outstanding reputation for fairness and commitment. Then, 20 years later, comes Stephen Harper. In one of his first acts, he opposed the International Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which Rights and Democracy had had a main hand in developing at the United Nations. Canada was only one of 4 nations to oppose that declaration. One of the next things that Harper did is he stacked the board of directors of Rights and Democracy with political hacks who knew nothing about international affairs, but they gave proper hell to Rights and Democracy's chair, Remy Beauregard. And after a contentious late-night board meeting in 2010, Beauregard went home and died of a fatal heart attack. Then last year, Harper closed Rights and Democracy, announced it would be closing and will be closing this year. Straight Goods News attended a farewell reception for Rights and Democracy last week in Ottawa. Joe Clark spoke there, as did former Liberal Cabinet Minister Warren Allman. They spoke with real sadness about how much Canada has changed since those days. Back then, Canadians disagreed about a lot of things, but they also found broad areas of consensus around women's rights, and Indigenous rights, and environmental protection. That same evening, we also went to a book launch for a book called Warrior Nation by Ian MacKay and Jamie Swift. That book talks about concerted efforts by Harper and conservative historians and academics like Jack Granatstein to rewrite Canada's history. They hate the whole idea of Canada as a peacekeeper. They'd rather see Canada as a guts and glory power, where soldiering matters more than the work of scientists and teachers and nurses and artists and writers and other civilians. They're rewriting history. For instance, they're spending $28 million promoting the War of 1812. That's almost the same amount of money as they're cutting from Libraries and Archives Canada, which prevents us all from being able to tell and know our own story. This is no casual or accidental kind of a scheme. This is a take no prisoners, scorched earth policy where they're cramming their vision of Canada down Canadians' throats. They want Canadians, for instance, to purchase expensive flying Etzels, F-35s. Yeah, there are better jets, there are cheaper jets, there are jets that are built in Canada, but they don't fit with the Harperites' notion of Canada as a warrior nation. You know, it's getting pretty desperate when people like me think that Brian Mulroney is starting to look good. There used to be such a thing as a Canadian consensus, and I'm hoping that that consensus still continues, and it probably will, unless this wrecking crew destroys it.